Naughty history for Insomniacs. The secret lovers of Marie Antoinette. The candles have burned down to the wick. The halls of Versailles are quiet now, save for the creak of an old floorboard and the rustle of secrets too stubborn to die. Tonight we drift, not just into sleep, but into scandal, into powdered wigs and whispered affairs, into the perfumed shadows of the 18th century. You've heard of her, haven't you, Marie Antoinette? The queen who dared to eat cake, allegedly. But long before the guillotine and long after the wedding bells, Marie was something more dangerous than decadent. She was lonely. And in the echo of that loneliness came lovers. So slip beneath the silk sheets, dim the lights, and prepare for a tale stitched with lace and laced with longing. This is dirty history for sleep. Tonight, the secret lovers of Marie Antoinette. Before she was a queen, before the wigs, the diamonds, the jealous whispers, and the guillotine, she was just Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, 15th child, youngest daughter, and perhaps, just perhaps, the most notorious woman to ever flutter a fan in the halls of Versailles. She was born in Vienna on a chilly November morning in 1755, with candles glowing in the corners of gold-leafed rooms and servants whispering her name like it already meant something. Her mother was none other than Empress Maria, Teresa, one of the most powerful women in Europe, and a woman who ruled her empire like she ran her family, stern, unblinking, and allergic to sentiment. Baby Maria Antonia, as they called her then, grew up surrounded by privilege, expectation, and the constant clicking of heels in marble corridors. She had music lessons before breakfast, Latin lessons before lunch, and dance rehearsals by moonlight. But here's the truth, whispered gently for your ears alone. Maria Antonia wasn't exactly a scholar. By most accounts, she was a charming airhead. Bright, yes, musical, very. But the tutors often complained she was more interested in learning how to curtsy than conjugate. Still, she was beautiful. That mattered more than Latin. By the time she was 10, her smile was already being sized up like a chess piece on the great board of European politics. Because in the 18th century, girls like her weren't born for stories. They were born for strategy. And Maria Antonia was about to be moved across the board. You see, Austria and France had a complicated history. Think of it as an 18th century version of frenemies with wigs. And so, to solidify an alliance between the two powers, it was decided by men in waistcoats and powdered faces that young Maria Antonia would marry the French Dauphin, Louis Auguste, heir to the Bourbon throne. She was 14. Now, imagine that. 14 years old, pulled away from everything you've ever known, your family, your language, your childhood, and sent hundreds of miles away to marry a boy you've never met in a country that already kind of hates you. Because yes, let's be honest, the French weren't exactly fond of the Austrians. They called her the Austrian woman like it was a slur, which for them it kind of was. When Maria Antonia arrived in France in the spring of 1770, she wasn't even allowed to bring her old clothes. No trinkets, no letters, no beloved dog. She was stripped of everything Austrian, literally. At the border, there was a grand ceremony where she was undressed and redressed in French fashion, like a doll being rebranded. She was no longer Maria Antonia. She was Marie Antoinette now. Welcome to France, sweetheart. Her new husband, Louis Auguste, was, well, bless his soft little heart. He was 15, shy, overweight, obsessed with locks, keys, and mechanical gadgets. Imagine being a teenage girl trained to charm kings and captivate courts, only to be paired with someone who, do you rather tinker with doorknobs than touch you? Their wedding was a glittering affair. A cathedral full of candles and nobles, the finest lace in Europe, a feast that could feed a kingdom. But behind all the gold and grandeur, a pair of teenagers who barely knew how to speak to one another. That night, Marie waited, in her new bed, In her new linens, in her new country, and Louis went to sleep. They did not consummate the marriage. Not that night. Not the next night. Not for 7 years. Court whispers turned into pamphlets. Pamphlets turned into slander. People blamed Marie, of course. Said she was too cold, too inexperienced, too foreign. But between us, Louis was terrified, possibly impotent, almost certainly ignorant. And so the young queen found herself trapped in a golden palace with no affection, no privacy, and no power, unless you count the power to pick your embroidery thread. Versailles was not a home, it was a stage, and Marie Antoinette was always on it. Imagine waking up every morning to a royal bedtime ceremony where your ladies-in-waiting dress you like a mannequin while nobles bicker about who gets to hand you your stockings. Imagine not being allowed to shut your own door. Imagine your every yawn being chronicled by people who de-sell your secrets for a sliver of influence. She once gave birth in front of dozens of courtiers, her legs parted, her crown still technically on her head, while people jostled for position just to say, "I saw the royal heir arrive." And through all this, her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, continued to write her letters, not sweet notes. No warm maternal advice. These were harsh, clipped commands. Please your husband. Produce heirs. Make yourself useful. Imagine receiving monthly guilt trips from a woman in a crown who ran half of Europe and still had time to micromanage your bedroom. Marie smiled. She curtsied. She obeyed. But inside, something was unraveling. You see, Marie was more than her pearls and powder. She was vibrant, restless, desperate for something real, something warm. So she did what women have always done when the crown gets heavy and the bed gets cold. She built a world of her own. She threw masked balls where laughter echoed past midnight. She danced until the candles melted into wax puddles. She wore hair so high it touched the rafters, once even fashioning a ship in her curls to celebrate a naval battle. She found her joy in gambling, in music, in mischief. She redesigned fashion, traded stiff court dresses for muslin gowns and ribbon bonnets. The other women followed her lead, and the old men fumed in silence. But even that wasn't enough. She needed space, air, somewhere she could just be Marie, not the queen, not the foreigner, just a woman. And so she built the Petit Trianon, a miniature palace nestled in the gardens of Versailles, her own private realm. There, she played at being a simple country girl, milked cows well, had them cleaned and perfumed for the occasion, and frolicked in pastel gowns with a circle of ladies who adored her. The press called it obscene. How dare a queen pretend to be poor, they hissed. But Marie didn't care. For a few fleeting hours in the gardens with her friends, she was free. And oh, those ladies. Gabrielle de Polignac, the Duchesse de Lambeau, pretty witty, fiercely loyal. They weren't just companions, they were her inner circle, her emotional lifelines. Some historians say it was all innocent, others. Raise an eyebrow. The libels, the gossip rags of the time had a field day. They painted Marie as a sapphic temptress, indulging in forbidden passions behind silk curtains. The truth? Likely somewhere between platonic devotion and sensual affection. But let's be honest, if your husband ignored you for nearly a decade, and you were surrounded by beautiful, doting women in a palace of your own design, well, even a queen has needs. And then, just as the rumors began to cool, he arrived. A man, tall, dashing, blue-eyed and brilliant, a soldier, a diplomat, a Swede. His name was Count Axel von Fersen, and he would change everything. Marie Antoinette was 20. She had already lived several lifetimes. A foreign bride, a reluctant queen, a symbol of alliance, a fashion icon, a target. But beneath all the powdered rouge and pastel portraits, she was something far more dangerous to the French court than a foreigner. She was human, And humans, no matter how tightly laced, ache for connection. Versailles was a palace built for spectacle, not comfort, not honesty. It was designed like a theater, and everyone inside was a player. The queen couldn't cough without a lady-in-waiting offering a handkerchief and a bishop offering judgment. Even her letters were often intercepted, dissected, shared. There were spies in her hallways, whispers behind her back, nobles whose sole purpose was to chronicle her moods, her looks, her laughter. In public, she played the role, smiled when expected, walked the halls like she belonged in them. But behind closed doors, when the doors would even close, she began to spiral. No one teaches you how to be adored and reviled at the same time, especially not at 20. Her loneliness wasn't loud. It crept, like perfume on a winter breeze. It slipped into her bedchamber when the candles were out. It whispered to her in Latin hymns she barely remembered from childhood. It coiled around her heart during those endless nights when Louis fell asleep before she even finished undressing. And it wasn't just about sex, though, let's not lie. That was certainly part of it. It was about longing, for intimacy, for connection, for someone who looked at her and saw not a crown, but a person. Her circle of women became her sanctuary. The Duchesse de Polignac, the Princess de Lamballe, 2 women, very different in temperament, yet both utterly devoted to Marie. Gabrielle, spirited, flirtatious, blonde as a bottle of chilled champagne. And Lamballe, quiet, sincere, always hovering nearby like a shadow made of silk. Marie called them her sisters of the soul. Letters from the time reveal tenderness that runs deeper than casual friendship. Phrases like, "You are my heart's most gentle companion," and "No one knows my truth but you." Sentences that today would be analyzed over bottomless wine in therapy. At Versailles, physical affection between women was common, even expected. Kissing hands, resting heads on shoulders, stroking curls while whispering secrets. But with Marie, it was more. There were rumors of midnight strolls, letters scented with jasmine, matching pendants tucked between corsets. One pamphlet, charmingly titled The Royal Sapphic Diary, even claimed the queen had a secret boudoir beneath the Petit Trianon where velvet cushions and perfumed oil awaited more intimate courtly rituals. Was it true? Hard to say, but if you're hoping for a definitive answer, darling, you're listening to the wrong show. What we do know is that Marie trusted these women, more than she trusted her own husband, more than her ministers, perhaps even more than herself. They shared her days, her tears, her laughter. They helped her design dresses and stage elaborate plays in the Queen's private theater, where Marie often played the role of a milkmaid, a shepherdess, or a servant girl, always cast as someone free of responsibility, free to love. At the Petit Trianon, she could take off the mask. No etiquette, no court protocol. Just wine, music, and the quiet intimacy of soft friendship. Or maybe something else, something sweeter. Her critics naturally hated it. The libels exploded. Pamphlets circulated like wildfire, describing scenes of debauchery in velvet lounges and sapphic ecstasy beneath bedsheets embroidered with the royal crest. They gave her nicknames: Madame de Balk, the Austrian harlot, Queen Whore of Versailles. One even printed a cartoon of Marie in a compromising position with 3 women, one of whom bore a suspicious resemblance to the Duchesse de Polignac. Even by today's standards, it was spicy. By 18th century Catholic France, scandalous enough to bring down a throne. But here's what truly rattled them. Marie didn't care. She didn't hide her friendships. She flaunted them. She gifted Gabrielle a lavish apartment in Versailles, promoted her brother, showered her with diamonds and gowns and honorifics. And for all the pearl-clutching nobles gasping into their monogrammed handkerchiefs, Marie's answer was simple: let them talk. Now, did this boldness win her any political allies? Absolutely not. It enraged everyone, from the church to the court to her own husband. But did it help her survive the crushing weight of her crown? In a way, yes. Because in those moments, in the shaded gardens of Trianon, in the quiet laughter shared beneath parasols, Marie was more than a symbol. She was herself. And it's in that soft vulnerability, in those stolen glances and held hands, that her true story begins to unfold. But fate, as it always does, had more in store, because soon a man would arrive. Tall, quiet, noble in every sense of the word. A man who spoke with his eyes more than his lips, and who saw straight through the silk and satin to the lonely girl beneath the crown. He was a diplomat, a soldier, a Swede. His name was Count Axel von Fersen, and for Marie Antoinette, he would become everything. He arrived in the spring of 1774, tall, stoic, blue-eyed, a Swedish nobleman, raised on frost and philosophy, battle-tested and heartbreak-shy. He walked like a man who had secrets sewn into his coat lining. Count Axel von Fersen didn't just enter Versailles. He haunted it. Marie noticed him instantly. Everyone did. But it wasn't the usual type of court attention. There was no sycophantic simpering, no nervous fanning. When Marie first saw Fersen at a mass ball, he didn't bow too low or flatter her excessively. He looked at her. Not the crown, not the gown, her, and that look, direct, steady, quiet, pierced through every polished layer of the persona she'd spent years perfecting. What followed was a slow-blooming obsession dressed in propriety. They danced, always appropriately. They spoke, never too long, but their letters ... of the letters. Full of layered compliments, coded affection, and aching restraint. Marie wrote, "My dear and tender friend, you are the most loved and loving being in the world." He replied, "I would give my life for one moment beside you, without the eyes of the world between us." This was no court flirtation. This was an emotional war. And while they played their roles in public, he, the diplomatic escort, she, the regal wife, in private, their bond deepened with every sigh, every glance, every moment when their hands accidentally touched too long. Gossip rippled. Of course it did. When a man shows up to Versailles, spends hours at the Queen's side, and starts learning French faster than a courtesan at confession, people notice. Some claimed they shared a night at the Petit Trianon, wrapped in secrecy and satin sheets. Others swore he used hidden corridors to visit her chamber during masked balls, slipping past guards and jealous noblewomen like a ghost wearing cologne. One rather vivid pamphlet described the Queen sitting astride Fersen in her private carriage, crown tilted just so, while whispering Latin verses between kisses. Historically inaccurate, but points for creativity. What we do know is that their letters were filled with longing and often censored. Many were destroyed. Some were edited by hand. Historians using UV light and chemical scans have uncovered redacted phrases. One, now partially revealed, may have read, "I cannot live without you. I burn with." And then the ink fades, like even the parchment couldn't bear the heat. They traveled in overlapping circles, appeared at the same events. Once, when Marie was ill, Fersen sent her Swedish pastries wrapped in linen embroidered with her initials. Subtle, elegant, scandalous in the way that only real love can be. And still, they never said it out loud, not publicly, never directly. Every I love you wore a mask. Every desire danced in metaphor. I wait for spring. The rose you gave me still blooms. Your silence wounds more than war. There were rumors, always rumors, that one of her children bore his eyes. That Louis Charles, the so-called lost dauphin, looked more Swedish than Bourbon. It's unprovable, of course. But history is built on unprovable things that feel just a little too true. What is certain is this: Axel von Fersen stayed. Long after other diplomats vanished, he didn't just linger. He protected her. When revolution began to stir in the gutters of Paris, when pamphlets turned from slander to threats, it was Ferzan who began to plan. He became not just a lover in whispers, but an architect of escape. But that's a story for another hour. For now, imagine this: the queen curled in her chaise lounge at dusk, ink staining her fingers, composing a letter she'll never send, Axel's handkerchief folded beneath her pillow, the perfume of lilacs, the echo of his voice in her memory. She loved him, maybe not with fireworks, maybe not with declarations, but in the long, slow burn of glances held too long, in the ache of unsent letters, in the quiet agony of wanting something the world says you cannot have. She loved him in silence. And silence, as we both know, can scream. Soon, France would burn, the crowds would roar, heads would fall, but before all that, before history sharpened its blade, there was this, a queen, a man, a longing too large for any throne, and a love that dared not speak, except on parchment sealed with trembling hands. It is one thing to long for someone. It is another to belong to them in secret, to carry their name not in your mouth, but in your marrow. And Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, mistress of none, that lover to a man history refuses to let her forget, belonged to Count Axel von Ferzan in a way she could never say aloud. He arrived at court like a gust of clean winter air, cutting through the perfume and powdered wigs with a look that said, "I don't care about your titles." Tall, aristocratic, with Nordic cheekbones and a soldier's gait, Axel von Ferzan did not try to charm the queen. And that's precisely why he did. At their first meeting, during a mass ball in 1774, Marie Antoinette was dressed as a shepherdess. White muslin gown, simple ribbon in her hair, the fantasy version of herself she wished she could be. Ferzan was in military dress, masked, but unmistakably elegant. They danced, nothing inappropriate. No bold declarations, just the warm brush of gloved hands, the flicker of interest beneath lace and restraint. From that moment on, he lingered. Whenever he was in France, he was never far from her side, and yet he never overstepped. His seduction wasn't one of roses and rhymes. It was in the details. A glance held just a moment longer than it should have. A letter folded with care. A pause before the word majesty, as if it made him ache to say it. Their letters, and oh, the letters, began innocently enough. Polite, grateful, diplomatically bland. But like all great affairs, they ripened in the shadows. I count the hours until I may again kiss the hand I dare not touch in daylight. You are my heart's most painful joy. Every breath is borrowed until I hear yours. This was not courtly banter. This was love. Real, inconvenient, and impossible. It wasn't just physical, though that too would come. This was soul deep. The kind of bond that made your name feel like it belonged in someone else's mouth. The kind of love that made every second apart a torment. Ferzan began learning French faster than most courtiers could tie a cravat. He was seen at the Queen's Theatre, at her card games, riding near the Petit Trianon, always a shadow in soft focus. But the moment things began to teeter, the revolution whispering outside Versailles like a distant storm, his role shifted. From admirer ... to protector, from confidant to co-conspirator. They began writing in code. Entire letters written in visible ink, cipher wheels hidden in false-bottom boxes, secret drops, agents posing as bakers and music teachers to carry their words. In one letter, Marie scrawled, "I dare not speak my truth to anyone but you. When the world sees me smile, it is only because I imagine you near." The libels, ever frothy with scandal, began printing wild accusations that Marie had taken Ferzan as her lover and made him her puppet king in secret, that he advised her on everything from hairstyles to high treason, that their affair had produced a child, Louis Charles, who was whispered to resemble Ferzan more than the Bourbon line. Historians still argue the point, but portraits of the boy raise questions, and those eyes, they didn't lie easily. What we do know, Farzan visited her often. He stayed long. He left quietly. Marie gave him private audiences in rooms no other man entered alone. She kept one of his handkerchiefs in a small lacquered box by her bed, wore a ring with his initials. One servant claimed to have seen them through a cracked door, Marie in her nightgown, sitting at a writing desk. Farzan behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Not carnal, intimate, the kind of touch that says, "You are mine, even if I must pretend you're not." By 1790, things had turned ugly in Paris. Food was scarce. The nobles were being dragged through the mud and then through the streets. The people wanted blood. And Marie was their vampire queen. Farzan, watching from the shadows, saw what was coming. He began planning, not for seduction, for escape. The plan was bold. A disguised carriage, false passports, loyal guards. He would smuggle the royal family out of France and get them safely to Austria, where Marie's family still held power. And yes, Farzan drove the getaway carriage himself. Picture it. A man in full noble disguise, Marie dressed as a governess. The king as a valet. The children drugged with laudanum so they wouldn't cry. A royal family crammed into a coach like stagehands in a bad farce. All for love and survival. They made it far. Almost to the border. But at Varennes they were recognized, arrested, dragged back to Paris in disgrace. Marie was humiliated. Betrayed by her own people. But her eyes, the chroniclers say, never left Farzan until the moment they were separated. His letters afterward grew frantic. "I should have died before allowing harm to come to you. Each night I wake thinking I have failed you anew." And Marie? Her letters were burned, many by her own hand. She feared they'd be found, that he'd be punished. What survives are fragments. A scrap of parchment with the word "adore," a broken seal with his crest, a pressed violet, and her ring, still on her finger. In the months that followed, as the revolution exploded, Farzan did everything he could. He begged allies, wrote petitions, bribed guards, but Marie was imprisoned, her husband executed, her children ripped away. And through it all, she wrote him one final time. The letter is debated. Some say it never existed. Others say it was intercepted and destroyed. But one witness, a servant who remained loyal, swore he saw her give a folded note to a nun the day before her death. It read only, "You were the light in my prison. If I dream in death, let it be of your hand in mine." When Farzan heard she had been beheaded, he locked himself in his study for 3 days. When he emerged, his hair had gone gray at the temples. He never married. And in his diary, decades later, he still wrote of Elle. Her, not as queen, not as mistress, but as the only person who ever truly saw him, and the only woman he ever truly loved. What was their affair? A scandal? A political liability? A fairy tale with a guillotine for an ending, perhaps, but above all, it was a love story. And those, darling, never die quietly. After the disaster at Varennes, Versailles no longer existed. Not physically, the palace still stood. The chandeliers still dripped crystal. The mirrors still shimmered with ghost light. But the illusion of untouchable royalty, that was gone. Shattered like a dropped wine glass on a marble floor. Marie Antoinette returned to Paris not as a queen, but as a prisoner in ribbons. Her carriage was surrounded by silent crowds, staring as she passed, no longer in awe, only in judgment. And Farzan? He watched from the shadows. He had barely escaped arrest himself. His role in the escape attempt was an open secret, whispered behind fans and flintlocks alike. He had driven the escape coach by night, wearing a servant's hat, blood pounding in his ears. He waited with clenched fists as checkpoints passed, each one a coin flip between freedom and a bullet. And when they were captured, when he realized he'd failed her, something in him cracked. His next letters were raw, jagged, desperate. I have failed you. I would tear my own heart out to reverse time. Your pain is my prison. If they take you again, I will not survive it. Marie, ever the queen even in grief, responded with gentler hands. Do not blame yourself. They would have taken me anyway. You gave me hope, and that is more than anyone has ever dared. In prison, she was stripped of every comfort. Her rooms were bare, her dresses plain, her attendants selected not for loyalty but for political neutrality. Even her children were taken from her arms, one by one, and yet she still wrote. She wrote to Ferzan in invisible ink, smuggled between the bindings of religious books. She dictated notes to nuns who memorized entire paragraphs and passed them in confession. She called him her only true knight, and Ferzan, across the border, across the world, was plotting, his personal fortune drained into bribes. He forged documents, hired mercenaries, staged false illnesses to get back into France under diplomatic guise. He even met with Marie's brothers in Austria, pleading for a military rescue. One letter, likely destroyed, was rumored to contain a plan so mad it bordered on romantic suicide. To disguise himself as a priest and enter the prison to replace one of the condemned so he could die at her side. Love makes fools of us all. But in Ferzan's case, it made him legend. In the final months of Marie's life, she was moved to the conciergerie, known as Death's Antechamber. It was damp, mold-stained, guarded night and day. She was no longer Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. She was Widow Capet. Her hair had turned white, her hands shook, but her eyes, they say, were calm. She wrote fewer letters now, but the last one historians confidently attribute to her. It was for Ferzan. The paper was thin, the handwriting tight, as if she were racing time itself. You were my home, my courage, my breath. I loved you beyond the flesh. If I am remembered, let it be as the woman who gave her heart to no throne, but to you. Ferzan never showed that letter. He never quoted it. But for years, he wore a ring with Marie's monogram on the inside, hidden, pressed to his skin. He never married. He kept her portrait above his writing desk until the day he died, murdered by a mob in Stockholm, beaten to death in the street. Some say they called him the Queen's whore as they struck him down. The affair between Marie Antoinette and Axel von Ferzan remains one of the most whispered romances in history. Never officially confirmed, never publicly admitted. But no one, not even their enemies, doubted its power. Because what they shared was not just a scandal, it was devotion. Treasonous, reckless, heartbreakingly tender devotion. They never danced at a wedding, never walked hand in hand in the daylight, never shared a home, but they shared everything else: letters, secrets, nights, plans. A dream of a life that history never let them have. And maybe, just maybe, that's why their story lingers. Because unfulfilled love, that kind of ache never dies. It haunts, like perfume on silk, like footsteps down a candlelit hall. Like a final letter never sent. When the royal carriage was intercepted at Varennes, everything changed. Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen on the run. She was a prisoner in pearls. The public jeered as she was paraded back into Paris. The same city that once cheered her wedding procession now screamed for her head. The crowd spat. Children pointed. Nobles averted their eyes. And through it all, her spine stayed straight. Her hands never trembled. Her lips, painted in defiance, did not part. But her heart, it shattered, quietly, and in a candlelit room somewhere far away, Count Axel von Ferzan collapsed. I should have died with them, he wrote, ink staining the page like tears. He had done everything right, every detail, every precaution. And still, the world had found a way to tear her from him. And so he began to unravel, not with panic, but with obsession. He began writing again, this time not only to Marie, but to foreign diplomats, Swedish ministers, Austrian generals. He penned letters with the frenzy of a man in love and at war, because to him there was no difference. He begged for troops. He offered money. He threatened, pleaded, and manipulated anyone who might still hold a shred of loyalty to the House of Habsburg. And in secret, he wrote to her. The letters that passed between them after her arrest are among the most haunting fragments of romantic history. They were written in invisible ink, with entire paragraphs redacted, blacked out, or chemically altered. But through modern analysis, some of those faded words have returned. I burn to be near you, she wrote. Every breath away from you is a betrayal of my own heart. They watch me always, she wrote another time, but they cannot stop my thoughts from wrapping around you each night. Marie, confined first to the Tuileries, then the Temple, was no longer the image of the extravagant queen. She wore plain muslin, ate boiled vegetables, slept under wool blankets in damp rooms. Her hair, once piled high with ships and swans, now hung limp around her face, streaked in white from stress and fear. But Fersen saw none of that. In his mind, she was still the woman in white, the girl with the biting wit and the hungry eyes. The woman who kissed him behind the tapestry, whispered his name into her pillow, and told him once, while tracing her finger down the back of his neck, "If I had been born common, I would have ruined you completely." He kept her letters in a locked drawer lined in velvet. He slept with one beneath his pillow. He began to dream of her, not as she was, but as she had once been, half undressed in the summer garden, barefoot in her theater costume, curls tousled, laughing with her mouth full of strawberries. I wake only to miss you, he wrote. The world is ash without your fire. In 1792, as the monarchy officially fell and France declared itself a republic, Marie's world shrank to the size of a prison cell. Her title was revoked, her attendants dismissed, her letters censored. She was no longer Marie Antoinette. She was Widow Capet, and still the letters came. One arrived smuggled inside the binding of a religious text, another sewn into the hem of a nun's robe. Each one from Fersen, desperate, passionate, and terrified. I would trade all the crowns of Europe to hold you one more night. If they take you from this world, I will follow. Marie replied, though fewer of her letters survive. One, barely legible through time-worn ink, simply reads, "Do not mourn me while I breathe. You still live in me." Some say Fersen tried to bribe the guards. Others claim he plotted another escape, a second Varennes, this time with more guns, fewer wigs, and no mercy. But it was too late. In January of 1793, King Louis XVI was executed, beheaded in front of a screaming crowd. Marie, now a widow in every sense, wore black for the rest of her life, even in prison, even alone. She was moved to the conciergerie that August. Known as Death's antechamber, it was the final stop before the blade. She was watched day and night, her meals rationed, her sleep disturbed. Her last letter to Fersen, if it ever existed, has never been found. Some believe she burned it to protect him. Others say it was intercepted and destroyed. A few claim it still exists, locked away in some dusty archive too scandalous to publish. Fersen claimed he received it. He never quoted it directly, but in his diary he wrote, "I have received her soul in writing. If there is mercy in death, may it bring her peace. I have none." On October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led to the scaffold. She wore white, the traditional color of mourning for French queens. Her hair was shorn, her hands were bound. The last thing she did was apologize to the executioner for stepping on his foot. She was 37. When Fersen heard the news, he reportedly locked himself in his study for 3 days. When he emerged, his hair had gone gray at the temples. He never recovered. He never married. In his journals, he called her mon amour immortal, my immortal love. In 1810, nearly 2 decades later, Fersen himself was murdered by a mob in Stockholm. They accused him of treason. They dragged him through the streets. And as he lay dying, one witness claimed he whispered just one word. Ow, her, that's all. History rarely tells love stories kindly, especially not ones tangled in war, scandal, and death. But love, real love, doesn't need approval, or documentation, or even survival. It just needs 2 people who see each other completely, and in the space between them, a flame. For Marie and Axel, that flame burned quietly, then wildly, then forever. Their affair may be a footnote in history, but it was the center of their world. And sometimes, the deepest loves are the ones never meant to live in the light. If love is the original sin, then gossip is the serpent that wraps around the tree, hisses in your ear, and hands you the apple with a wink. And for Marie Antoinette, it wasn't the truth that destroyed her. It was the lies. Not that she was innocent, of course. No one who builds a milk-made fantasyland with perfumed livestock and diamond nipple rings is truly innocent. But the stories told about her, the pamphlets, the paintings, the whispered filth passed between sweaty hands in the alley behind the print shop, they were less royal biography and more historical erotica meets revenge porn. They called them libels, satirical pamphlets designed to entertain, scandalize, and seduce the public into hating their queen. They sold by the thousands. Cheap, crude, plastered with woodcuts of Marie in positions you won't find in your average museum brochure. She was drawn straddling the clergy, bent over a throne, lounging in orgies with masked noblewomen and leather-clad bishops. One particularly charming publication titled The Royal Bordello claims she ran a secret lesbian society in the basements of Versailles, where political deals were sealed with lace whips and perfumed thighs. Another, Memoirs of a Bedroom Tyrant, described in graphic detail how Marie allegedly seduced her guards, her hairdresser, and naturally, her own brother-in-law, all while wearing nothing but pearls and a powdered wig. Now, let's be clear. Almost none of this was true, but that wasn't the point. Marie had become something bigger and more dangerous than a woman. She was a symbol, a stand-in for every grievance the people had against the monarchy, extravagance, corruption, sexual deviance, and cold, foreign arrogance. And in the blood-stained theater of revolution, symbols don't need to be real. They just need to be believable and a little bit arousing. What made Marie such a perfect target wasn't just her decadence. It was her mystery, her silence, her refusal to explain herself. She didn't beg, she didn't defend, and that infuriated them. So they filled in the gaps. They turned her into a harlot in heels, a nymphomaniac with a throne. They said she paid for her wigs with sex, that she had lovers inside furniture, that her carriage smelled like cinnamon and shame. Her real sins were far more mundane. She liked parties. She liked silk. She liked the idea of being loved more than the burden of ruling. But nuance never sold as well as scandal. And so, the image of Marie the Queen was devoured by Marie the Slut of Versailles, a fictionalized, hypersexualized fantasy stitched together with envy, lust, and national rage. Even the affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal she wasn't involved in at all, was twisted to paint her as a greedy sex witch who demanded cursed jewelry in exchange for carnal favors. In one cartoon, she's shown accepting a diamond necklace while straddling a cardinal like a throne, moaning for France. Again, not true, but delicious, wasn't it? And that was the problem. The public didn't want the truth. They wanted a bedtime story, wet and vengeful, about the downfall of a wicked queen. And Marie, she refused to play the part. She wouldn't confess, wouldn't grovel, wouldn't weep in public. She held her head high, even as they undressed her with their words, and beneath all of that filth, Beneath the ink and the caricatures was a real woman, tired, lonely, unraveling, her body a battlefield, her reputation a brothel. She still wrote to Fearson during these years. Though fewer letters survive, we know this much. She clung to him. Let them spit. Let them draw me naked in the square, she wrote. You know the truth of this body? And he replied, always tender, always furious. If they wish to paint you, let them choke on their brushes. They will never touch the skin I've kissed. It wasn't just love. It was war. And in war, image is everything. The public's fantasy of Marie was more powerful than the real woman. And in the end, that fantasy, sticky with desire and heavy with judgment, would be the thing that killed her. But we'll get to the guillotine soon, darling. For now, let's linger a little longer in the libel. Because even when the stories were cruel, they were hot. And no one ever said a bedtime story had to be clean. In one libel, Marie was described as the royal furnace, always hungry, always burning, insatiable in bed, and bankrupting the kingdom one climax at a time. Another claimed she used royal funds to commission an automated bed that rocked itself in rhythm with her lovers, complete with silken restraints and a gold-plated swan's head that dispensed perfume mid-thrust. Total nonsense, and yet deeply imaginative. People hated her, yes, but they also fantasized about her. She became France's national dominatrix, the woman you blamed for your hunger while still dreaming of her in heat. It wasn't just her power they feared, it was her body. The way she used it, the way they imagined she used it. Even her fashion became sexualized. Her low-cut gowns, her exposed shoulders, the sheer gauze she wore in portraits, all painted as proof of her immorality. Her nipples guide the nation, one pamphlet sneered. Another accused her of treason of the thighs, claiming she accepted Austrian gold in exchange for orgies with foreign spies. And who always appeared beside her in these lurid illustrations? Fearson. They called him the sweet on top, Marie's foreign plaything, the man who whispered rebellion into her ear, and kept her too busy moaning to notice the revolution. One caricature showed Fearson as a centaur, half-horse, dragging Marie behind him in chains, her corset ripped, her crown askew, her tongue out like a drunken heat. It was porn, passed off as patriotism, and the people devoured it. You see, it wasn't just the fall of the monarchy they wanted. They wanted to humiliate her, to strip her of dignity and lace and make her crawl. They wanted to turn her into a joke, a cautionary tale, a dirty picture. And in the face of all that, she smiled, tilted her chin, refused to break, because Marie understood something very few people ever do. Shame only works if you accept it, and she never did. When they cut her hair, she didn't flinch. When they disrobed her in prison, she folded her gown herself. When they forced her to wear plain white, mourning clothes, the color of royal death, she made it look like a uniform. Her final days were soaked in scandal, yes, but also in grace. Dangerous womanly grace. There are reports, unconfirmed, but whispered with awe, that she sang in her cell at night, that she recited verses in Swedish, that she kissed the page after finishing her final letter. One guard said she slept with Fearson's miniature in her hand. Another claimed she carved his initials into her bedpost with a stolen hairpin. And still, the stories raged outside the prison walls. They said she begged for sex in exchange for mercy, that she offered herself to her guards, that her last request was for a mirror and a man. But in truth, her last request was for paper and ink. She didn't want to die beautiful. She wanted to die heard. And so she wrote, I forgive my enemies. I forgive their lies. But I leave the truth to history and to the man who knew me best. She never mentioned Fearson by name. She didn't have to. The truth of them was in every libel, every whisper, every blush from a man reading one of those scandalous pamphlets in the dark. The public believed they were lovers. And that belief, that obsession, was what made their affair immortal. Even if the real thing was quieter, slower, a touch on the back of a hand, a look across the room, a secret letter in a hollowed-out prayer book. Even if the sex never happened at all, the fantasy of them was so potent, it bled into history and refused to wash out. That's the thing about Scandal, darling. It doesn't care if it's true. It only cares if it tingles. And Marie was electric. Her trial wasn't really a trial. It was a striptease for the mob. 2 days of accusations, innuendo, forged letters, and wild claims from men who couldn't look her in the eye but had no problem describing her in bed. They called her a seductress, a manipulator, a foreign parasite who ruled France from between her thighs. They accused her of bankrupting the nation with her spending, which, fair, but also of conspiring with Austria and sleeping with half the army. But the lowest blow? They accused her of incest. Yes, they claimed she had molested her own son, the young Dauphin, in a twisted plot to corrupt the royal bloodline from within. It was monstrous, invented, but devastating. When they read the accusation aloud, the courtroom went silent, and Marie, she stood, looked her accusers in the eye, and said, "Nature refuses to answer such a charge." I appealed to all mothers present. That sentence broke the silence like glass. Even her enemies lowered their eyes. It was her finest moment. And it didn't matter. She was condemned anyway. The sentence, death by guillotine. She spent her final night alone in her cell, writing, remembering, folding her soul into a page. Some say she wrote one last letter to Farzan. Others say she simply closed her eyes and imagined his voice, his touch, the warmth of his breath against her neck. She once told him, in a letter long since lost, "When the world forgets me, remember me only as I was, beneath the lace, between the lines." On the morning of October 16th, 1793, she dressed in white. No jewels, no makeup, just the color of widowhood and defiance. Her hair had been cut, crudely, roughly, by a butcher's assistant. She bled from the scalp, but didn't flinch. A priest offered her comfort. She declined. She was led through the streets in an open cart, exposed to the very people who once worshipped her like a goddess, now spitting and throwing stones at their broken Venus. But some wept, quietly, behind handkerchiefs. Because even stripped of wealth, reputation, and dignity, she was still beautiful. And beauty, even when reviled, commands silence. At the scaffold, she stepped lightly, delicately, like a dancer taking her final position. She stumbled once and accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner. Her last words, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." And with that, a queen fell, but the legend rose. In the weeks that followed, the libels stopped being satire. They became eulogies. Portraits of her began to sell again, but this time, in sorrow, the same mouths that had mocked her now whispered, "She died with grace. She died with fire." Farzan, upon hearing of her execution, wrote simply, "My soul has gone before me." He never again spoke publicly of their love, but in his journals, he returned to her again and again, sometimes by name, sometimes just an initial, sometimes in Swedish, sometimes in silence. The scandal faded. The politics shifted, but the story, oh, the story, refused to die. Even today, Marie Antoinette is remembered not just for cake or couture, but for desire, for rumor, for the way she lingered in men's dreams and women's warnings. She became the patron saint of public shame and private passion, and through it all, one man loved her. Not perfectly, not openly, but fully. And that, my dear, is the dirtiest history of all. Death is supposed to silence the noise, but for Marie Antoinette, it only turned up the volume. In the decades after her beheading, her image became a playground, a blank canvas, a doll to dress and undress again and again. Artists painted her flushed with innocence, pale lips parted, eyes wide with longing. Others chose to immortalize the scandal, draped in silk, corset unlaced, pearls dangling between bare breasts. Erotica flourished, not about her policies, not about her politics, about her mouth and the rumors. They aged like wine soaked in sin. Books claimed she'd had secret children, that Ferzan visited her prison in disguise for one final night of passion. Niche of the internet where historical filth still sparkles. She's still there, riding the wind in her white muslin, lounging in her pleasure garden, laughing behind a fan. And beneath the wigs and the politics, the accusations and the executions, is something tender, something hot, something too dangerous to name out loud in its own time. Love, raw, inconvenient, indecent love. The kind that defies etiquette, that survives slander, that dies in the flesh but lives in the letters. That is their legacy. Not the pamphlets, not the propaganda, but the pause between paragraphs, the heat in a phrase that meant one thing to the world, but something else to him. Marie and Ferzan. Joseph and Oscar, a queen and her ghost, a soldier and his shrine. The world tried to bury them in shame, but history has a thing for forbidden love stories, especially the ones that end with a kiss that never quite lands, a letter that never quite arrives, and a final word whispered too softly for anyone but the dead to hear. Long after the blade had fallen, long after the mob had gone home and the blood was washed from the cobblestones, she remained, not in body, but in ink, in whispers, in the soft fold of a letter no one was supposed to read. Marie Antoinette didn't die when they said she did. She lingered in scandal and seduction, in the heavy pause between myth and memory. The 19th century was kinder to her than her own. Painters began reimagining her as a tragic heroine, not a harlot, but a holy martyr in silk, a Madonna in muslin. In salons and parlors, people began speaking of her with reverence, almost regret. And yet, beneath the hymns and history, the eroticism remained. They couldn't help it. You can't bury a woman whose story makes your pulse race. Erotic novels appeared, some disguised as memoirs, all dripping with powdered lust. In one, Marie spends her final night in prison, pleasuring herself to a memory of Ferzan's voice. In another, she's reborn in heaven, naked, unrepentant, and riding Ferzan like a ghostly stallion across the clouds. Trash, absolutely. But enduring trash, Marie became the original pinup martyr. A woman too dangerous to live, too beautiful to fade, too scandalous to forget. Her face, her form, her myth, they all stayed, in paintings, in portraits, and perfume. Even now, centuries later, you'll find her on candles and corsets, in costume dramas and kink forums, in dream journals and historical fanfiction. She is desire wrapped in tragedy, the fantasy of the punished beauty, the ultimate what if. And what if Ferzan? His name faded, but his ache didn't. In Stockholm, there's a small statue of him in a quiet corner. No fanfare, no crowd. Just a man with tired eyes and a hand clutched to his chest, as if still holding the ghost of a letter no one else could read. He once wrote in the privacy of a worn leather-bound journal. She lives still in the places where I am most silent. Some say he carried her miniature until the day he died. Others claim he had a lock of her hair hidden behind the lining of his jacket. A priest said he found her name carved into the underside of Ferzan's writing desk. Not written, carved, with a blade. Marie, just that. He had survived battles, riots, courts, and kings. But he never survived her, and that, darling, is how you haunt someone. Not by lingering in shadows, but by wrapping yourself around their ribs like silk and never letting go. Marie and Axel became something larger than lovers. They became the story you tell when you want to remember what it feels like to want what you cannot have. To taste love, and lose your head for it, literally. And so their love, whether consummated or not, exists forever in suggestion and innuendo, in the pause between breath and confession. He never said, "I loved her" on paper. She never wrote, "He touched me" in ink, but in every smuggled page, every flicker of eye contact across a ballroom, every moment they chose to remain silent when the world begged for scandal, they told us everything. Love like that doesn't need to be explicit. It just needs to make the heart race. In whispers, there's something delicious about unfinished business, especially the kind you can romanticize. After their deaths, Marie and Ferguson became characters in other people's stories. Ghosts you could dress up, write poems about, summon during seances. In the 1800s, as the French tried to forget the revolution's blood-soaked hangover, Marie became a strangely sacred figure. Not a queen, not a traitor, but a woman wronged. A tragic beauty martyred for her taste in pastries and men. Portraits of her returned to drawing rooms. Her face appeared on perfume bottles. Letters allegedly written by her, forged, mostly became collectibles. A few were filthy. Supposed secret correspondences between her and Ferguson surfaced. Heavy with longing, drenched in phrases like, "I burn for you still," and "Your name lives beneath my skin." Were they real? Maybe, maybe not, but they sold. Ferguson became a literary device, the doomed lover, the tragic knight. Some erotic novels painted him as her rescuer, sneaking into her cell for a final, desperate night of passion before she faced the blade. Others claimed he fathered a secret child, smuggled out of France, raised in Sweden under an assumed name. And then there were the conspiracy theorists. Some whispered that Ferguson had actually faked his death, that he vanished into the countryside with Marie's last surviving maid, guarding her letters like sacred scripture. One woman in the late 1800s claimed to be Marie reincarnated. She wore powdered wigs, refused to eat cake, out of protest, she said, and wrote steamy diary entries to Axel. Her seances drew crowds. People would sit in silence while she claimed Marie's spirit entered her body. She'd moan softly and say things like, "I see him, the pale man with trembling hands. He is not touching me, but I am undone." Sure, it was theater. But wasn't it always? Marie Antoinette was many things. A girl forced into a crown. A woman vilified for spending too much and speaking too little. A lover who may or may not have burned for a man she could never fully claim. But mostly, she became a feeling. The flutter in the stomach when you know the affair is dangerous. The ache in the throat when love arrives too late. The heat between the ribs when you read someone's name and pretend not to care. She became lust, dressed as royalty. Regret, powdered and perfumed. Desire, punished by history. And Ferguson? He became the kind of man women imagine at midnight. Not perfect, not safe, but ruinous in the best possible way. The kind who doesn't ask for permission. The kind who waits outside your window in the rain, cigarette shaking in one hand, your name already tattooed on his tongue. You can't put that in a museum, but you can feel it. In the hush between pages, in the creak of the floorboards late at night, in the pause before sleep when your brain wanders to things you were never supposed to want. Marie and Ferguson are dust now. Bones in separate countries, their letters mostly gone. Their bodies long rotted, but the ache is immortal. And you, lucky, curious thing that you are, just spent the night in their secret. Sleep now. Let them hold you a while. The queen and the ghost, the scandal and the silence. And if you dream of lace and locked doors, if you hear a name you've never said out loud before, don't worry. That's just Marie saying goodnight. History has a crush on Marie Antoinette, and it never really got over her. In the centuries since she lost her head, she's been resurrected more times than a guilty pleasure. Painters, poets, pop stars, they all want a taste. You've seen her. Even if you didn't know it, the cotton candy curls, the laced up corsets, the pout that says, I know I'm trouble, and I dare you to find out how much. She's been in everything from punk fashion editorials to erotic fiction, from royal biographies to Halloween costumes that toe the line between regal and risk. Sofia Coppola made her into a rock star teenager, all eyeliner and ennui, nibbling macarons while Versailles crumbled. Perfume ads wrap her in feathers and silk, a sugar-drenched goddess with secrets behind her smile. Burlesque troupes invoke her name like a spell. Art students sketch her in the nude, as if trying to strip away the monarchy and get to the girl underneath. And maybe that's the point. Marie never really belonged to France, or to history, or even to herself. She belongs to us now, in that little corner of the brain that lives for drama, danger, and forbidden pleasure. We remember her not because she ruled, but because she ruined the image of a perfect queen, ruined the myth of the sexless monarch, ruined the neat line between tragedy and temptation, and Ferzan. He's the sigh in the background of every historical love story. The man you're not supposed to think about at 3 a.m., but do. He was never meant to be hers. That's why it mattered. Because love is safest in the shadows, sexiest when it's whispered, and most powerful when it doesn't get a happy ending. We are drawn to them because they lost, because they burned for each other and then were consumed. That's the kind of story that slips under your skin. That doesn't need facts or proof, just feeling. And now, here you are, lying back, eyes closed, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. Maybe you feel it. The weight of a secret lover's gaze. The imagined brush of powdered fingers against your wrist. The echo of a name you've never spoken aloud, but somehow always knew. That's not fantasy. That's history. Dirty, dangerous, sleep-drenched history. The kind they never taught in school. The kind meant to be whispered at midnight. The kind that doesn't end when the story does. Now sleep. Let the revolution fade. Let the lace fall. Let the ghosts have their hour. You've spent the night in Versailles, and not a single soul saw you sneak back out. You've just listened to naughty history for Insomniacs, where scandal slips into satin sheets, and forbidden's love never quite stays buried. Tonight's tale, the secret lovers of Marie Antoinette, a royal affair stitched together from rumors, ribbons, and ruin. Was it true? Maybe. Maybe not. But sometimes the most seductive truths are the ones we choose to believe. If this story lulled you into curiosity or carried you into sleep, then you're exactly where you belong. We'll be back with more whispered tales of risk rails, misbehaving mistresses, poets with bedroom eyes, and victims that moaned before they fell. Until then, sleep softly, dream scandalously, and remember, history may forget their names, but we won't. This has been Naughty History for Insomniac, where scandal never sleeps, but you can.